This week's discussion board is going to have you take a look at your methodology for your analytical report. I find this to be one of the areas that students tend to have the most trouble with. So let's take a quick look at how methodology works in different areas so that we can better think about how methodology will work in our own analytical reports. So here we are at an article that was published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, a fancy schmancy article with all of its scientific facts and data. You're probably familiar with these. This one was about the potential that people have in shooting subjects of different races. So, a super controversial issue published a long time ago when it was much more of a big news than it is now. And so, if you look at this, there's a lot of things that are probably familiar to you. It begins with the abstract, they have their introduction, and then it moves into their methodology, much like our reports do. And so, here, when you think about this type of scientific journal, the methodology is really about what did you do in order to get your results, right? So in this case, they had different groups of participants. I think they did three. They had a procedure. Here's what they did. They basically had them play these types of computer games, what the tasks was in the games, what types of things they were monitoring. So their methodology section is quite long because there's a lot of different things that go into factors here. Ours really don't have to be that long at all, but just to give you that sense of it. And here's another example where methodology comes into play. So this is actually on this person's blog, right? And what he's looking at is the top literary magazines, the top literary magazines for fiction in 2014. So literary magazine, for those who don't know, is often a place where creative writers like me submit their short stories or their personal essays or their poems, right? So you often want to get them published in good literary magazines so you have better readers. So you might get to this site though and say, well, what are you ranking these on? How do you decide that Plowshares is better than Tin House? Like, for example, this is a case where I would probably disagree with him, right? And so what you'll notice is that people often talk about how they do these things. So my method is straightforward. I used a 10-year database and I give points for magazines that get prizes awarded in major prize thingies, and if they get special mentions they get certain points, etc., etc., etc. So you get what I'm saying is that we're not just taking him at his word. This is not just his opinion on what's better, but he actually has some sort of scientific method for coming up with this. Think about it, if we were saying what's the best city in the Southwest, well, by whose standards? Somebody from Arizona might make a argument for Phoenix, but let's not get into that. Instead, let's go back and now think about our analytical reports. So by now, what you should already have, or at least be thinking about and narrowing down, is the research question, right? So again, you want to think about your audience, and then you want to think about what their needs are. So in this case, this was a student's example. He was doing a report for the Albuquerque mayor on whether or not the police are using their power wisely. That was his wording. So what he's really looking at is police brutality. And so when I first talked to this student about his analytical report, he wanted to do this as his methodology. Well, first I want to talk about the causes, then I want to talk about the consequences, and then I want to talk about reported cases. And so my big question for him was, but let's put these on the same screen. How did these three things actually answer this question about whether or not there's a problem? The answer is it doesn't, right? It's not. This is like the kind of thing that might be an outline for a research paper in another class on police brutality, but in terms of a methodology, the methodology is really about how are you going to answer this question. So let's take a look at what a revised methodology might look like. And again, remember, these are just notes. These are not drafted in the regular form. These are just notes and thoughts. So in this case, what we talked about, the student and I, is that really what he wanted to do was first he had to come up with some sort of criteria. Well, he's using this idea of wise and unwise. So, like, what makes something unwise? And so, his first task will be to do secondary research on police brutality, looking at things like excessive force, etc. And then, whenever you comes time to write these methodologies, you want to mention things like keywords and where you looked for those, whether they were in databases or newspapers or etc. In his case, he really was looking at library databases. And then, once he had done that research, he would have a sense of how those of what really made something good or not, or bad or wise or unwise. And so then he took the to the Department of Justice site, which lists all the different cases of police shootings in Albuquerque, and he was wanting to take them by a case by case basis based on these factors that he identified in his secondary research. I'm then going to look at a case by case basis. So, do you get how this really helps you know, okay, are they using it wisely or not? Well, first I'm going to decide what's wise and what's not. Then I'm going to look at the cases, and based on the answers to that, I can then reach my conclusions, right? And so, your logical mapping, it could be as simple as this. You might take it a little bit further and add like different notes onto it here, like, narrow to the key um, elements that make something unwise. Again, his wording. And you could do it this way. You could also do the bubble map if you like. In the next discussion board, I'll show you a bubble mapping. But also, since I have you, just want to show you how these results then translate later on into the report. So again, this is just an outline form, and this happens to be a student that I was working with him on the report, so he was already further along than you. But when he did his secondary research, he found things about race, he found things about mental illness, he found things about times when they're defying authority, not following directions, he found times when police are in danger, things about different levels of lethality, like could they have used a taser or a pepper spray instead, or just sort of, secured them without having to do a fatal shot, and then also things about trainings. And so from these criteria, then he kind of narrowed it, and he was talking about like really like taking those ideas and turning them into factors. So here, like, was there a crime that's being committed? Could something else have been done? What were the factors? Was race a factor? Was mental illness a factor? Was, I don't really remember what Power Trips was, but the idea that now when he's looking case by case, he's really looking at like which of these things came into play. And clearly some things are going to be more okay than others. So if the police is in danger and his life might be at risk, then taking that shot seems to be more justified than if he is just racist, or if he's just sort of, oh, maybe here's where the power trip came in, right? If it's about defying authority and he just has a power trip about it, that's probably not justified, right? And so that way, in his results, he can really present his data, based on these 50 cases, you know, uh, 25% of them are not justified. Or, maybe he finds that they all seem to be actually pretty good, except for like one or two about mental illness, right? And so what you'll notice is that your results sections, if you follow your methodology, will guide you to your conclusion. So if, for example, he found that race played a huge factor in these shootings, then maybe his recommendation is for about a training about race. Okay, and I'm going to show you one more just because that one is pretty specific to the APD thing. And this one is one where maybe you want to end up using surveys and such. And so really quickly, is marijuana a problem on UNM campus? First you have to find out the extent of the problem on campus, doing various things, maybe doing surveys, interviews, looking up statistics, or if the university has a report on drug usage, you might bug your librarian to say, how do I find out like what the problems are here on campus, right? And then thinking about what tasks are affected by that and how that might relate, right? So you don't want to just like, I think everybody's instinct is just to go straight to like, here are the goods and bads of marijuana. But really, if you're looking at the problem on campus, your audience isn't going to really care about the goods and bads of marijuana. They want to know, do we have that problem? If we do, what are the things that might affect us as students? Or he was looking at even like professors and staff people. Okay, so a lot of information here. Again, for this logical mapping board, you can do it in any way. If you want to use a list, use a list. If you want to use a picture, use a picture. But really think about what steps you want to take to do your research, not just the outline of what your paper might look like. Okay, and always let me know if you have any problems or questions.